They never told you this. Because if they did, you'd stop believing the polished paintings, the silken curtains, the romantic tales of the Ottoman palace. You'd see the harem not as a paradise of jewels and perfumes, but as a gilded cage where beauty had an expiration date, and when that date came, the punishment wasn't exile. It was erasure. Picture this, a moonless night in the imperial palace. Somewhere deep inside, past a dozen locked doors, lies the women's quarters, a labyrinth of corridors lit only by oil lamps. A concubine, barely 20, sits by the window. She once danced in front of the Sultan himself, wearing silk imported from far-off lands. But tonight, she's wearing nothing that would protect her from the cold stone floor. She knows the guards are coming. In the Ottoman court, beauty was currency, and once it was spent, you were worth less than nothing. The Sultan didn't keep every woman forever. When a concubine lost her allure, or worse, attracted suspicion, she was no longer a prized possession. She was a liability. And liabilities were removed quietly. Some were sent to remote provinces to marry soldiers or officials, a polite execution of status. You'd never be seen in court again. But for others, the end came in ways that whispered through the walls. A silken cord around the neck. A quiet splash in the Bosphorus. No grave. No name. No record. The historians who tell you the Ottomans treated their women with dignity are either blind or bought. The truth was, every woman in that harem lived under a silent clock, and when it struck midnight, she was gone. You're not supposed to know how deep this went, or how carefully it was hidden. Because once you understand, you'll start to see the same patterns, in every empire, in every era, even today. And by the time you've heard it all, you won't be able to look at power, or beauty, the same way again. The palace called it retirement. But that word was a mask, a velvet curtain hiding the iron bars behind it. A discarded concubine was rarely left to live freely. The Sultan could not afford her gossip, her memories, her knowledge of his habits, his weaknesses. And so, the so-called retirement estates were often little more than distant prisons with better furniture. You think exile sounds merciful? Imagine being placed in a strange town where every man knows you as the Sultan's reject. Where women whisper when you pass, their eyes scanning you from head to toe like an old tapestry, once precious, now faded. You were forbidden from returning to Istanbul. Forbidden from speaking of the palace. And always watched. But exile was a privilege. For others, the exit was silent and final. In the dead of night, they'd come with a bowstring, a weapon favored by the Ottomans for executions within the palace. It left no blood, no stain, no noise to carry through the corridors. The guards, called bastanchi, were loyal to the death. Their faces revealed nothing. The act was quick, the body removed before sunrise. Then there was the Bosphorus, that dark, endless vein of water that carried secrets away. Women were bound, placed in sacks weighted with stones, and dropped into the black waves. The current took them far from the palace, their final resting place somewhere unseen, unmarked. The harem was a stage, and the Sultan, its sole audience. When you lost your role, there was no encore. Do you think this cruelty was born of pure malice? No. It was born of power, and the paranoia that always walks beside it. The harem wasn't just about pleasure. It was a political weapon. Every woman was a potential spy, a potential mother to the next heir, a possible queen-maker or king-breaker. The Sultan's bedchamber was the most dangerous political arena in the empire. And if a woman fell from favor, it was not always because her beauty faded. Sometimes she simply knew too much. Maybe she'd overheard a conversation between the Grand Vizier and the Sultan. Maybe she'd been seen whispering to another favored concubine. In a place where secrets were more valuable than gold, such things were enough to seal your fate. The harem's hierarchy was a delicate web. The Valide Sultan at the top, then the Sultan's favorites, then the rest. Jealousy was a constant undercurrent. One whispered lie could lead to an accident. A gift of poisoned sherbet. A physician's treatment that never cured. And outside the palace? You were forgotten. Your beauty, your stories, your voice, erased like they had never existed. This is the part the museums don't tell you when they show you jewel-studded dresses and golden hairpins. They don't mention the silken noose hidden in the folds. They don't tell you about the cold hands that dragged a woman to the river at night. Because the Ottomans were masters of the one truth that every empire knows. The public only remembers what you let them remember. In the Sultan's court, even mercy was a performance. Some discarded concubines were gifted to high-ranking officials. It was a way to tie loyalty with silk, to give a man a woman who carried the scent of the palace on her skin, a reminder of the Sultan's generosity. But make no mistake, these women were still prisoners, just in a different cage. Their new husbands often treated them as trophies, not partners. And they never forgot where they came from, because their every word could still be reported back to the palace. One slip of the tongue, and they could vanish even from their new homes. Others were sent to the old palace, Eski Saray, a place that was less a home and more a graveyard for the forgotten. Imagine hundreds of women, stripped of their titles, their silks, their jewels, living in shadow. the laughter of the harem replaced by a suffocating silence. These women carried the scent of lost power, and in the world of men who worship strength, that scent is poison. No one wanted to be reminded of what happens when the Sultan looks away. And yet, behind the silence, the old palace was a hive of whispers. Women traded secrets like contraband. They told the truth in hushed tones, passing stories from one generation to the next. It was in those hidden conversations that the real history of the Ottoman court survived, not in the Sultan's decrees, not in the official chronicles. And that's why the empire feared them. Because even discarded, even silenced, they remembered. If you've been listening closely, you've already felt it, that chill that comes from realizing you've only been shown the surface of history. The harem wasn't a romantic prison. It was a battlefield without swords. And the bodies didn't always bleed. We are taught to think of power as a throne, a crown, an army. But here, power was a look, a whisper, a choice made behind curtains. And in that quiet war, the Sultan was not merciful. Those who were cast out were more than just women, they were evidence. Evidence that beauty fades, that loyalty is conditional, that even the closest to power can be discarded in the dark. That's why their erasure had to be absolute. And here's the part you must not miss. This pattern, this method of removing and forgetting, has not vanished. It has simply changed its clothing. You see it in politics. You see it in corporations. You see it in every system that worships power. When you are useful, they crown you. When you are not, they silence you. And the silence is the most dangerous part, because it makes the rest of the world think nothing happened at all. We've only just stepped inside the gates of this story. The corridors go deeper, darker. The truths you're about to hear are the ones that make historians tremble. Because once you know them, you'll start to see the same game everywhere you look. The harem was never truly about love, it was about control. Every smile from the Sultan, every gift of silk or pearls, was a calculated investment. And like any investment, it came with a built-in exit strategy. But the part they don't tell you is how the removal of a concubine wasn't always about ending her life. Sometimes it was about breaking it. Some women were deliberately married to cruel men. Men chosen for their temper, their brutality, their ability to crush whatever spark was left in the woman's spirit. These unions served a purpose, to erase the woman's will, so even if she spoke, her voice would carry no strength, no threat. In other cases, women were given to distant military garrisons on the edge of the empire. It was exile to the cold frontiers, where winters froze the blood and summers burned the skin. Places where the Sultan's name meant little, and survival was a daily battle. This wasn't just removal, it was erasure by slow decay. Because death leaves a mark. But if you can make the world forget someone while they're still alive, you've erased them more completely than the grave ever could. You might wonder, why go to such lengths? Because the harem was more than the Sultan's private world, it was the heart of a shadow government. The women inside weren't just lovers or ornaments. They carried influence in whispers, in pillow talk, in letters passed through trusted servants. Some were daughters of foreign rulers, placed in the harem as political hostages. Others were trained from childhood in the art of seduction, conversation, and subtle persuasion. These women knew how to plant ideas in the Sultan's mind without him ever realizing it. And that's why when a woman lost favor, she was never simply ignored. She was neutralized. The bowstring was only for the urgent threats, the ones who knew secrets that could shake the throne. For the rest, exile or reassignment was enough to break their network, scatter their influence, and keep them from ever finding their way back to the heart of power. The empire couldn't risk the possibility of a discarded concubine becoming a rallying figure for rebellion, or worse, a symbol of the Sultan's weakness. Imagine the psychological toll inside those palace walls. You live each day surrounded by beauty, marble floors, jeweled ceilings, fountains that sing in the courtyard. But you know every luxury is a chain. You watch as one woman after another disappears. At first, they tell you she was married off to a pasha in some distant province. Later, you hear the real whispers. She left in a sack, under moonlight, her body claimed by the Bosphorus before dawn. Every time you see the guards pass by, your pulse quickens. Was that glance at you a warning? The fear was constant. It sharpened the women's tongues, made alliances fragile, and turned friendships into wagers. One day's confidant could be tomorrow's accuser. In that pressure cooker, paranoia became second nature. Some women volunteered to leave the palace before they fell from favor, hoping to escape with their lives. But here's the truth. You didn't leave the Sultan's shadow. Even far from the harem, his reach could still find you. There is a lesson in this, one that every man who seeks power must understand. Once you are inside the Game of Thrones, there is no outside anymore. You're in until you're nothing. The most feared of all punishments wasn't the bowstring or the sack. It was disappearance without explanation. When a woman simply vanished, no announcement, no replacement, it poisoned the air of the entire harem. Every glance between the remaining women carried a silent question. Who's next? The Sultan never had to raise his voice. The uncertainty itself was the weapon. Over time, this cultivated a kind of self-policing system. Women censored themselves. They stayed silent about injustices. They smiled when they wanted to scream. Because the one thing worse than speaking out was being erased before anyone could hear you. And that is the essence of psychological control. Not just punishing those who disobey but making everyone so afraid they punish themselves. The Ottomans didn't invent this system, they perfected it. And when you recognize it here, you'll start to recognize it in your own world. By now you can feel the walls closing in. You understand that the harem's beauty was its most dangerous illusion. But here's where the descent truly begins, because what we've covered so far is only the surface. The real darkness lay in the rituals, the unspoken rules, the hidden corridors where the Sultan's will was enforced without witnesses. The bowstring wasn't always delivered by a guard. Sometimes the death came from inside, a rival concubine given permission to remove her competition in exchange for a step up in the hierarchy. Poisoned sherbets, doctored perfumes, sleeping draughts that were never meant to wake you, all of it happened in those chambers. And the most chilling part? These acts weren't seen as crimes. They were considered the order of things. Because in the palace, morality bent to the will of power. And when the Sultan wanted you gone, the method was irrelevant. Only the silence afterward mattered. And this silence, is the key to understanding not just the Ottoman harem, but every system that seeks total control. There's a reason the most dangerous place in the empire wasn't the battlefield, it was the Sultan's bedroom. The bed was where heirs were conceived, and in the Ottoman world, an heir was a loaded weapon. Every child a concubine bore was a potential future sultan, and therefore a threat to every other woman in the harem. The moment a concubine lost the sultan's interest, her child's safety became uncertain. If the boy was still young, he might be sent far from the capital under the pretense of education, and there, quietly disposed of. Mothers fought not just for the sultan's affection, but for the survival of their bloodline. And when a mother fell from grace, she often fell alone. The empire knew no mercy for women who had outlived their usefulness. Some women were executed alongside their children to remove any trace of their claim to the throne. Others watched their sons strangled before their eyes, their screams swallowed by the thick walls of the harem. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. This was strategy, the cold mathematics of dynasty. The fewer rivals for the throne, the safer the empire. And if that safety required the drowning of an innocent, it was done without hesitation. The bowstring, that silent instrument of execution, deserves its own place in this descent. It was woven from silk, smooth enough not to cut the skin, strong enough to crush the windpipe in seconds. In the palace, its use was considered merciful. There was no blood, no public spectacle, no mess to clean. It was a private death for those who had once been close to power. For discarded concubines, the bowstring was often the final kindness they'd receive. It meant the Sultan still considered their death worth a shred of dignity. But make no mistake, the act itself was intimate, personal. The executioner had to be close enough to feel the last breath leave the victim. And in those final seconds, the woman knew who had ordered it. Death in the harem was never anonymous. Every silken cord carried the weight of betrayal, the reminder that in the palace, love was only ever temporary. Then there was the Bosphorus, the black artery of Istanbul. Its waters were both a lifeline and a graveyard. Discarded concubines who posed a greater threat, or who had angered the wrong person, were often sewn into weighted sacks, their bodies bent and bound so tightly they could not scream, could not struggle. In the dead of night, guards would carry the sacks to the water's edge. The splash was quiet, almost polite, and the current carried them away. By morning, the river would look as calm as ever. The Bosphorus kept no records. It did not betray its secrets. And that is why it became the empire's perfect accomplice. The river could swallow the Sultan's mistakes, the jealousies of his favorites, the silent orders passed through trusted lips. And the city learned a simple truth. When someone vanished from the palace without explanation, you didn't ask questions. Because questions had a way of ending up in the water too. There were fates worse than death, and the old palace was one of them. It was the empire's gilded prison, where fallen women were sent to fade into irrelevance. The walls were high and unyielding. The gardens overgrown. The air thick with the perfume of wasted youth. Inside, hundreds of discarded concubines lived in a half-life, neither free nor truly imprisoned, but stripped of all influence. They became living ghosts. No man of rank would speak to them. No servant would carry their words beyond the walls. And over time the women began to erase themselves. Their laughter dulled. Their beauty withered. Their stories grew thin and uncertain. The old palace wasn't meant to kill them. It was meant to make them disappear while still breathing, a slow, deliberate erasure of the self. To the outside world they no longer existed. And inside those walls they began to believe it too. If you've stayed with me this far, you're starting to see the truth. The harem was a machine. A machine that could take in the most radiant, gifted, and intelligent women from across the known world, and grind them into nothing when their moment passed. It didn't matter if you were the daughter of a pasha, a princess from a distant land, or a girl taken in war. The machine treated you the same, valuable when wanted, disposable when not. And here's where I'll ask you to do something dangerous. If you understand what I'm saying, if you feel the weight of it, write these words in the comments right now. The river remembers. Write it twice. Let it be a mark that you see through the illusion. Because the truth you've heard so far is only the beginning. The next steps in this descent will take you into the inner chambers, the whispered assassinations, the deals made between the Sultan's lovers and his enemies. And once you know them, you can't unknow them. Inside the harem, death didn't always arrive from the Sultan's command. Sometimes, it was delivered by the women themselves. In a world where beauty was survival and influence was power, every rival was a threat. One concubine's rise meant another's fall. And in the game of shadows, no one waited for the Sultan to make the decision. A silk scarf, accidentally, left near a flame that set a rival's chambers ablaze. A serving of sherbet laced with crushed glass or mercury. A jar of perfume infused with slow-acting poison, gifted with a smile and a bow. The Sultan rarely intervened in these matters. If a woman could not defend herself, she wasn't worth keeping. And so, the harem became a self-cleaning battlefield, where survival meant thinking like a predator, or becoming prey. Every glance carried meaning. Every gift was a test. Every whisper might be the last thing you ever heard. And in the center of it all, stood the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother. She was the most dangerous woman in the empire, the only one who could command the Sultan himself. The Valide chose which concubine saw the Sultan, which gifts reached his hand, which whispers reached his ear. She could make a girl into a queen with a single word, or send her to the Bosphorus without leaving her chambers. Many discarded concubines owed their downfall to the Valide's quiet hand. Sometimes it was political, removing women loyal to a rival faction. Other times it was personal, jealousy disguised as concern for the Sultan's well-being. And no one dared challenge her. Because the Valide didn't just control the harem. She controlled the historians, the chroniclers, the memory of the empire itself. If she wanted you forgotten, history would oblige. The harem's corridors weren't just gilded, they were wired with invisible strings of loyalty and fear. Every servant, every guard, every eunuch, was someone's eyes and ears. A careless word to a maid could find its way to the Valide's chambers by nightfall. A private conversation in the bathhouse could be repeated to the Sultan before the water had cooled. This constant surveillance wasn't only for protection, it was a test. The Sultan and his mother measured the women not by their beauty alone, but by their ability to survive under the weight of paranoia. If a woman cracked, if she broke under suspicion, she was gone. The discarded concubines weren't just removed because they were no longer desired, they were removed because they had failed the unspoken exam. Could you keep your mouth shut? Could you keep your allies close without giving them a knife for your back? Some women learned to weaponize their own exile. Sent away to distant provinces, they became the secret hands of political rivals, carrying messages, gathering intelligence, undermining the Sultan from afar. These women were the most feared, because they had nothing left to lose. And so, the palace developed a cruel efficiency in handling them. A gift of poisoned wine delivered on the night of a new marriage. A bandit attack, on the road that conveniently left no witnesses. A sudden illness in the dead of winter, with no physician willing to treat it. The empire didn't just kill these women, it killed them in ways that looked like fate. Because fate leaves no trail, and history doesn't prosecute destiny. By now you've probably felt the shift. We're no longer talking about concubines as individuals, we're talking about them as pieces in a game. Pieces that could be moved, sacrificed, or removed entirely, so long as it served the player who sat on the throne. This is where the Ottoman harem stops being a place and becomes a system. A machine fueled by desire, guarded by fear, and lubricated by silence. The discarded concubines were its waste product. The ashes left after beauty burned too brightly or too long. And just like in our world today, those ashes were swept away quickly, because no one wants to be reminded of the cost of power. The further we go, the more you'll see, this wasn't just history. This was a blueprint. A design so effective at controlling people that echoes of it are still alive in the systems you live under right now. Removal from the harem was not always sudden. Sometimes, it was staged. The Ottomans understood the power of symbolism, of turning one woman's fall into a warning for the others. A concubine who had fallen from grace might be summoned to the Sultan's chambers one last time. She would dress in her finest silks, her most dazzling jewels, believing, or perhaps forcing herself to believe, that she had been forgiven. But instead of a feast or a night of passion, she would be handed a single object, a folded silk scarf or a small silver bowl filled with dark water. These were not gifts, they were sentences. The scarf meant strangulation. The bowl meant drowning. No words were exchanged. No accusations made. The woman would simply be escorted away, and within hours she would be gone. Every woman in the harem knew these symbols. And the message was clear: step out of line and this will be your fate. The execution itself could be a ceremony. In some cases, the condemned concubine was dressed in pure white, a color that in the Ottoman court symbolized both purity and death. She was given sweet sherbet to drink, a final kindness to calm her nerves, though sometimes it was laced with sedatives. The bowstring executioners, the bastanci, would arrive in silence. No shouting, no chains, only the cold efficiency of men who had done this many times before. The strangulation was quick, but the aftermath was meticulous. The body was washed, perfumed, and wrapped in fine linen before being carried away under the cover of darkness. No one spoke of it the next day. In fact, the most chilling part was how life in the harem went on as if nothing had happened. Music still played, servants still poured tea, the fountain still sang. That was the true cruelty. Not just the act, but the erasure. There were times when the execution wasn't meant to be quiet. If the Sultan wanted to send a stronger message, the woman's removal would be staged in front of a select audience. The most ambitious, most dangerous concubines. They would watch as the condemned was led away, her head held high or bowed low, depending on whether she chose dignity or submission. The sound of the bowstring tightening was enough to silence every whisper for weeks. And here's the genius of it. The Sultan didn't need to make public executions a regular thing. 1 or 2 well-placed displays were enough to keep every woman in line for years. Fear doesn't need repetition. It only needs memory. But there was another kind of removal, one even colder than execution. Sometimes, the Sultan would have a concubine erased from existence without ever laying a hand on her. Her name would be struck from palace records. Her portraits destroyed. Her possessions redistributed as if they had never belonged to her. Even the servants who once attended her would be reassigned and forbidden from speaking her name. It was as though she had never been born. And this, perhaps, was the most terrifying fate of all. Because death ends your story. But erasure convinces the world you never had one. You might think these are just stories from a distant, brutal past. But look closer. The methods may have changed, silken bowstrings replaced with corporate dismissals, the Bosphorus replaced with reputational destruction. But the principle remains. Remove the threat quietly. Make it seem like nothing happened. Ensure that those who remain know exactly what did happen, without ever hearing a word. This is how power sustains itself. Through symbols. Through silence. Through the unspoken understanding that anyone can be removed, no matter how close to the throne they think they are. And in the Ottoman harem, that understanding wasn't just survival, it was law. Now we go deeper still, into the whispers that never reached the historians, and into the events so dangerous that even palace insiders pretended not to see them. Every harem was a kingdom in miniature. And in every kingdom there are rebels. Most concubines accepted their fate in silence, because to resist was suicide. But once in a while, a woman would decide she had nothing left to lose. One such woman was said to be Ice Hatton, a beauty from Circassia whose wit matched her looks. She had once been the Sultan's favorite, showered with gold and guarded like a jewel. But when a rival rose in his affections, Ice was pushed aside, quietly at first. Her rooms downgraded. Her jewels reassigned. Her servants taken away. She was meant to fade. She did not. Ice began to gather allies, not just among the concubines but among the eunuchs, the laundresses, even the scribes who managed the harem's letters. The palace was a web of whispers and she learned to pull the right threads. One night, she smuggled out a letter hidden inside a bundle of embroidered cloth. It was addressed not to her family, they were too far to help, but to a rival faction in the court. Her offer was bold. Information in exchange for protection. And the information? Secrets about the Sultan's private dealings that, if revealed, could shame the empire itself. The plot might have worked, if betrayal hadn't come from within. One of her closest confidants, a young concubine desperate for favor, reported her to the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother and the true power in the palace. Ice was seized before the letter ever left the city. Her punishment was swift, but not execution. The Valide Sultan wanted to make her suffer slowly. She was banished to the old palace, a sprawling, decaying building where former concubines lived out their days in obscurity. It was called a retirement, but everyone knew it was a graveyard for the forgotten. The old palace was a crueler fate than death for a woman like Ice. No silks, no jewels, no power, only cold stone corridors and the company of bitter, fated women who spoke endlessly of what they used to be. Outside, Istanbul thrived with color and music, but inside, time crawled. Yet even here, Ice refused to be erased. She began to keep a hidden diary, written in the margins of Qurans and poetry books, detailing the inner workings of the harem and the crimes of those who ruled it. Some say those writings survived. Smuggled out over the years by sympathetic servants, they supposedly made their way to Europe, where diplomats and travelers whispered about the confessions of the Sultan's woman. Historians today argue over whether these documents were real or just legend. But in the palace, the effect was real enough. The Valide Sultan tightened her grip, and trust within the harem eroded even further. Ice herself died in obscurity, buried in an unmarked grave. Yet the idea that one concubine's words could outlive the empire? That was more dangerous than any bowstring. And it was proof that even in the most controlled cage, some birds still learned to sing. The harem's cruelty wasn't always in chains and bowstrings. Sometimes it was in silence. To fall from favor could mean being unseen, ignored by servants, denied music, left without a mirror for weeks so you forgot the face you once knew. The women called it the fating and they swore it could drive a person mad. Some said they'd seen concubines who once laughed like bells begin to stare at walls for hours, whispering to themselves as if holding on to an imaginary friend. But whispers in the harem went deeper than loneliness. In a place so full of devotion and ritual, superstition was a second language. There were stories of binding spells, charms hidden in clothing or sewn into pillows that could sap a rival's beauty, rot her teeth, or make her stumble in the sultan's presence. Some claimed the Valide Sultan herself kept a shadow room, a locked chamber where dolls made in the likeness of troublesome concubines were kept, each pierced with a single golden needle. No one dared ask if it was true, but they all slept a little less soundly. Then there were the trials. Officially, the harem had its own court, a set of eunuchs and elder women who handled disputes. Unofficially, these trials were theater. The outcome was decided long before the accused entered the room. A concubine might be accused of theft, disloyalty, or worse, consorting with a man outside the palace. The evidence could be as small as a scarf left in the wrong place, or a servant's word taken as fact. Punishment was rarely physical. Instead, they dismantled your life, moving you to a room with no windows, assigning you to scrub floors alongside the lowest slaves, erasing your name from the sultan's registry. One of the cruelest fates was the glass banquet. A condemned concubine would be made to sit in the grand dining hall, the same place she once dined as a favorite, while others feasted around her. Servants would pour wine into her cup but never let her drink, set food before her but remove it untouched. It was a performance meant for the entire harem to watch, a reminder of what happened to those who crossed the wrong person. When it ended, she was escorted away in silence, her humiliation echoing louder than any whip crack. These punishments worked because they targeted the mind. In the harem, beauty was currency. Attention was life. Take those away and you didn't need to kill a woman to destroy her, you only had to make her believe she no longer existed. And so, the most dangerous weapon in the palace was not the bowstring or the poison cup. It was the slow erasure of self. And the knowledge that in a world built on desire, being unwanted was the worst death of all.